Hello, my name is Jeremy Gibbard, and I will be talking about sustainable neighborhoods. What are the requirements for sustainable neighborhoods, and what are the implications? I'm going to argue that with COVID-19, neighborhoods have become even more important. We can see the impacts that can be achieved through neighborhoods. And I'm going to use a tool called the Built Environment Sustainability Tool, the best tool. I'm going to apply this to a particular neighborhood and show the performance of the existing neighborhood and then post a number of interventions. So proposed situations after the intervention, talk a little bit about findings, and then finish off with some conclusions and suggestions for shortcuts to achieving more sustainable neighborhoods. What's very interesting is that if we look at what's happened under COVID-19, there's been very substantial reductions in activity in many areas. And the particular ones that are of interest are the green ones. This is surface transport changes. So this is congestion in cities, mobility, and what you can see here is there have been up to 60, 80% reductions in congestion. And this has been a result of people staying at home. So people doing things locally, getting food locally, not commuting, not traveling long distances to school. And there's a very interesting aspect to look at. And really kind of one of the consequences of that change in emphasis to a kind of much more local uh, situation is there's been a huge reduction in global fossil fuel carbon emissions. You can see that here is there's been almost a 10 to 20% reduction in carbon emissions. And of course, a lot of that has to do with industry shutting down, etc. But a substantial aspect of that is a change in lifestyle and work patterns. And that's very much what I want to talk about in the neighborhood presentation, is to say we really need to rethink how we live, our commuting patterns, and what we can achieve through local access to products and services. Unfortunately, one of the other effects of COVID is a huge projected increase in poverty rates. So these are figures from the World Bank, and what they show is they show that we may go back 10 years in terms of increased poverty as a result of COVID. So again, the interesting emphasis here is really that we not only need to address issues such as climate change and carbon emissions, but the urgent social and economic issues. So how do we address increasing unemployment? And one way of doing this is to work in a coherent way to address the Sustainable Development Goals, which address both climate change and social and economic development. So this table on the left shows the different goals, the 17 goals, and the tool that I'm going to show you, called the BEST tool, has these criteria. So it has shelter, mobility, food, goods, services, etc. And they correlate very well with the Sustainable Development Goals. So part of what I'm going to argue is that the tool is quite a good measure of the capability or the support for the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals. So how does infrastructure, how do buildings, neighborhoods support the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals? And this is the tool. It has a component that looks at existing neighborhoods, which is this one, and then the proposed neighborhoods, which is that one. And you can put in up to 6 different interventions, and it then shows you a report where you have the existing situation in red. The blue is the situation post the intervention, and so you can see very easily the improvement from the existing to the proposed as a result of the interventions, and there are a number of detailed scores in here. So you can see graphically very easily that you go from a red situation, a very poor performance situation, to a green, which is a good performance situation as a result of these different interventions. And so you can swap in and out different interventions and try and see what has the greatest impact for the least resources or the least time frame implications. These are the different criteria, and they cover in a very holistic way both environmental issues, economic issues, and social issues. So the neighborhood that I'm going to look at is this neighborhood in Pretoria, very clearly identified by roads on 2 sides, and then a mountain, a nature reserve on another. If we zoom in, you can see the neighborhood, a fairly typical wealthy neighborhood, large houses, gardens, a lot of space. At one corner, there's a small shopping mall with a mixture of restaurants, small supermarkets, some office buildings, and then behind it are the residential buildings. And what has been happening, which is interesting, is that around the periphery, there's been a natural densification as residential plots get developed into commercial buildings, but you can also see the kind of quite large sites that the residential plots have. So this is the commercial development happening. So if we use the best tool for as an analysis of the site, we look at the different areas and we can compare the densities of the residential area, the densities of the commercial areas, office areas, with sustainable densities, benchmarks within the best tool, and we can identify a range of gaps in terms of the criteria that I showed earlier. And if we then go through that, what this shows is this is the performance of the existing neighborhood. And what's interesting about this is it shows that the biocapacity is strong. It's got a nature reserve, it's got some parks, so it's got good biocapacity. It's got very poor capacity in terms of waste. There's very little provision for waste around the neighborhood, so it's difficult to recycle and reuse materials. Limited services, local services, so things like banking, access to government services within the neighborhood. The same thing within goods, very limited access to things like furniture, clothes, equipment, etc., with a low ecological footprint that's manufactured locally within the neighborhood. Food also not easy to access. Some parts of the neighborhood are quite a long way from the retail area, so it's not local. And mobility, again, there is roads within the neighborhood, but very little provision for walking, cycling safely around the neighborhood. There. If we look at shelter, buildings are large, so there's insufficient density and very limited use of renewable energy, very limited local employment if you compare it to benchmarks, no local education, so any children within the neighborhood have to travel to schools elsewhere, no adult education, some facilities for health, so there's a park, etc., but not much else. And then biocapacity, which we covered. So you can see here there's some areas of high performance, but mostly fairly low performance within the neighborhood. So if we then look at different interventions to address the gaps, the low performance, we can come up with 6 different interventions, and that's what I'm going to cover next. The first is the idea of an education hub. It's building an education hub in one corner of the site that has access to early childhood development. So there's 60 places for children locally, a primary school, secondary school, and adult education. And you can see the impact of that, as you'd expect, improves education performance. It's not big enough to score a 5, so you'd need a substantially bigger hub to score better, but it makes a good impact. The next one is a food hub, and the idea here is to create intensive vegetable gardens and a food market to enable better access to fresh vegetables and fruit, very low ecological footprint. It would also create local jobs, and again, as you'd expect, that improves substantially the food performance and a little bit around things like employment. The next one is work densification, and what this does is take out some of the existing blocks and create far more workspaces. So there's increased variety, lots of support for small enterprises, affordable rental, and this is conditional. So there would be substantial incentives to bring in types of enterprises that would address some of the gaps that we talked about earlier. And what's interesting about this is you can see that has had a multiple effect. So there's support for employment, but also substantial improvement in terms of access to low ecological footprint services and goods because of this conditional requirement. The next one is residential densification. So this is to increase densification within the neighborhood to achieve the standards, the benchmarks for sustainable urban design. And what you can see here is it doesn't have a huge improvement, but there is an improvement in terms of performance locally. The fifth intervention is to have an energy microgrid. So this is to increase the energy efficiency of all the buildings on site and then have a renewable energy microgrid where you can trade renewable energy generated in photovoltaic panels across different sites. So you'd create some local employment enterprises and hugely reduce carbon emissions. The last one is to have a program that puts in lots of provision for recycling, so recycling of organic matter, paper, tin, plastics, glass, etc. And again, this would create local jobs, local enterprises, and ensure that all the waste, as far as possible, was recycled and reused. So it would have a substantial impact on the waste set of criteria. So what's interesting, if we come to the findings, what we see here is the report from the BEST tool with the existing performance. You can see most of those figures are in red. And then as a result of all of the different interventions, the proposed performance, and you can see there's been a substantial shift to kind of green in a lot of areas. And you can see those figures here as well. So the combined effect of the interventions have moved really the sustainability performance in terms of the best score from 1.24 to 3.45. And you can see that in the graph. So that's the original level of sustainability performance, very poor. And as a result of the interventions, there's been a substantial improvement. So from the red through to the blue. Ultimately, what the tool is suggesting should be aimed for is this particular corner of the graph. So if you develop all of the characteristics of a sustainable neighborhood, your proposed should end up there. So one of the things to look at in terms of the next iteration of interventions would be how do we address aspects of employment, shelter, mobility, so we can keep pushing that into that corner. What is also very interesting is to look at the impact of different interventions. And what we can see here is that the work densification intervention has by far the greatest impact. So it affects 7 areas because it obviously creates jobs, but also creates better access to services, to products, local services, local products, better access to things like health, etc. And it makes up about 43% of the improvement that we saw earlier. So that's very interesting. Education hub, the energy microgrid, the food hub, all have fairly similar impacts, and then the least significant impact is the residential densification intervention. So if we look at conclusions, there are a number of quite interesting findings that are coming through. So the first is the suggestion with this study that if you can increase local access to facilities, goods and services that are needed for everyday life, there are many advantages. So you can create more local economic activity, employment, enterprises, and you reduce the requirement for travel, accidents, carbon emissions associated with cars, etc. So that's the first one. The second one is the idea of conditional development, which is linked to the work densification intervention. And what this suggests is that you develop neighborhoods in a conditional way. You target specific enterprises that you want, that will support sustainability and access, and you ensure that they are included in the development, and that hugely improves the sustainability performance, the capability of the area to support the SDGs. The third one is making sure in the way you design your interventions to always create local employment, to create sustainable enterprises. So again, you recycle a lot of the income and activity in the area, and so there's a positive feedback and synergy that you achieve through that. The next one is multi-use infrastructure, and this is really the idea of saying that a lot of infrastructure, such as schools, are only used a few hours a day, and there's no reason why a lot of that infrastructure couldn't be used in the evenings or at weekends to increase impact. And the advantage of that is that if it's local, it's very easy to access, and you can improve education very easily, for instance, for adults, through that at very low cost and with very low environmental impact. The last one is around local governance, and this suggests that if you, in implementing and designing your interventions, draw in local people, local governance, and ensure that there's very strong involvement, you are more likely to get facilities provision that prioritizes local needs and are inclusive. So they would address specific things like accessibility, making sure that people can really get to the facility very easily and are affordable, so that you don't exclude, a large proportion of local inhabitants as a result of cost. Thank you very much. If you're interested in the study or the built environment sustainability tool, there's more information at my website, jeremygibbard.com. There's also information on Gauge, which has developed aspects of the tool. So thank you very much. Bye.